Hi, I'm Margaret. I'm a senior.
And I'm Ellie. I'm also a senior. And today we have the pleasure of introducing our speaker. Elaine Weiss is a Baltimore-based journalist and author whose writing has appeared in numerous publications such as The Atlantic and The New York Times. Her feature writing has been recognized with prizes from the Society of Professional Journalists, and her byline has appeared in many national publications as well as in reports for the National Public Radio. She was awarded a Pushcart Prize, Editor's Choice Award, and she is a proud McDowell Colony Fellow, a testament to her excellence as a writer. She has also worked as a correspondent in Washington, a congressional aide and speechwriter, as well as a magazine editor and university journalism instructor.
Weiss's most recent book, The Women's Hour: The Great Fight to Win the Vote, has won critical acclaim from publications such as The New York Times, The Wall Street Journal, Christian Science Monitor, and The New Yorker. The book is hailed as a riveting, nail-biting political thriller with powerful parallels to today's politics. It brings the fight for the 19th Amendment to life, taking place in Nashville in August of 1920. After 70 years of women working for the right to vote, the ratification of the amendment has come down to Tennessee. The book chronicles the inspiring story of activists winning their own freedom in one of the last campaigns rooted in the Civil War, while also winning an early 20th century battle for civil rights. The Women's Hour is a Reader's Choice Award, a finalist for the Chautauqua Prize, and received the American Bar Association's highest honor, the 2019 Silver Gavel Award. Soon, you'll be able to watch The Women's Hour, as it is currently production for a television series with Steven Spielberg's Amblin TV company. Daryl Frank, Justin Falvey, and Hillary Clinton are the show's executive producers. Please join us in giving Ms. Weiss a warm Harpeth Hall welcome.
Thank you. Hello, can you hear me all right? Sound okay? I'm just delighted to be with you this afternoon, to be invited to Harpeth Hall, and to introduce you to the story of the suffragists, the brave women, young women and older women, who joined together to win the right to vote for you. And many of Nashville's daughters were among these courageous activists. And we're looking at a picture, a photograph of a suffrage march here in Nashville in 1912. So some of your relatives may be in this picture. Some of the leading Tennessee suffragists were once sitting where you are sitting today. Maybe a slightly different auditorium, but they were sitting here. Your city played a very important role in winning the right to vote for all American women. And Nashville and Tennessee were the stars of the last episode of the women's suffrage movement. You might say it was a very long series. I know that many of you are not old enough yet to vote, but soon you will be. And voting is the most important civic responsibility that you as an American possess. And it's the greatest privilege of a citizen. It's the fundamental right of a citizen of the democracy. And if you treasure your sense of being an American, you should be voting in every election once you become eligible. And until 1920, women, American women, were not allowed to vote. Women were not full citizens. They had no voice in how their community or their city or their state or their nation was run. Women and girls were considered less important, less intelligent, less able than men and boys. We know that's silly. And denying us the vote was part of that broader assumption. They said we were too scatterbrained, too emotional, too fragile to handle thinking about tough issues. Women were meant to stay at home, take care of the children, and that was that. So this is the story of women who forced that attitude to change by working together towards a goal. Women of all races and religions, from all political parties, old and young, rich and poor, in every state of the Union. They changed attitudes, and they also changed laws. My book tells the story of the 19th Amendment, and it tells how American women's demand for that vote, once considered radical, crazy, subversive, impossible, was slowly and methodically and through very hard work transformed into the law of the land, into a constitutional amendment, the 19th Amendment. We'll be commemorating the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment in this coming year. And Nashville will be at the center of those celebrations. And there's a lot of fascinating events that you'll be able to be part of. But today, I want to tell you why that centennial is important. The story of the 19th Amendment is the story of the largest extension of democracy in our history. It gave the vote to half of the citizens of the United States who were not included when the Founding Fathers constructed our government, supposedly by and for the people. So it's a story about how change can be made in a democracy and in society. And I think you know how important making change in our world today is. And so this is a bit of a guidebook for you on how you can, in your lives, start making change. These changes were made by citizens, by young people like you. The 19th Amendment was not just a legal change. It was not just a constitutional change. It didn't just double the national electorate. It didn't just make women full citizens for the very first time. It marked a societal change, a cultural shift in the role and the rights of women. And that change, as we know, is still ongoing. The enfranchisement of the American woman did not come easily. It required 7 decades of tireless work by 3 generations of activists in over 900 campaigns at the state, local, and national level. They worked in the states where only men could decide if women deserved to vote, and with rare exception, they decided no. And they worked in Congress, where the federal amendment was stalled for 40 years, and action was not taken. Finally, after the Congress did pass the amendment in June of 1919, it went out to the states, and in the summer of 1920, 35 states had accepted the amendment, ratified as it's called, and 1 more was needed to make it fully ratified for it to enter the Constitution. This would have given all women in every state, in every election, the right to vote. Tennessee, it turns out, could be that 36th state. If the Tennessee legislature approved the amendment, it would become part of the Constitution. If the amendment failed in Tennessee, it could be delayed indefinitely and perhaps not enacted at all. The enfranchisement of half of the citizens of the United States was at stake, and it all came down to Tennessee. By 1920, the suffragists had been fighting for the vote for 72 years, since that first outrageous demand for the vote was made by Elizabeth Cady Stanton at the Seneca Falls Women's Rights Convention in 1848. You've probably heard of Seneca Falls. And one of the reasons the meeting was called was because women had so few rights at this time in America. Besides being denied the ballot, a woman also did not have the right to testify in a court of law or bring a civil suit. She couldn't be judged by a jury of her peers because women could not serve on juries. She could not be admitted to most universities or professional schools or colleges. Educating women at that time in the mid-19th century was actually considered a waste of time. I think all the women here at Harpeth Hall could refute that very well. At that time, their destiny was really only to be wives and mothers. And educating women was actually considered dangerous. Conventional medical wisdom of the time held that women were too fragile and too nervous to handle deep study. You could use that as an excuse next time you have an exam. And if they did study, again, this was accepted medical wisdom, blood flow would be diverted to their brains from their reproductive organs, endangering their future ability to bear children. So the entire species was at risk. This was one of the arguments used to deny women the vote. If a woman was married, any property or wages belonged to her husband. She had no custodial rights over her children. They too belonged to the father. She was not supposed to speak in public, just as I am speaking to you. My standing here at the podium and speaking to you would have been considered outrageous. So Elizabeth Stanton tackled these at the Seneca Falls meeting. That's what it was about. And one of her demands was for equal pay for equal work. This was 170 years ago, and we're still not there yet. But she also wrote a resolution demanding women be given the right to vote. Now, many of those attending the meeting thought that asking for the vote was a terrible idea. It was really too radical. It was ridiculous. They'd be made fun of if she did it. They begged her to withdraw that demand. But there was a young man in the audience who stood up, and he rode his buggy 50 miles from his home in Rochester to attend the meeting. And it was Frederick Douglass, just 30 years old, just 10 years out of slavery. He had come to support the women. And he stood up and he said, no, you must demand the right to vote, because it will never be given to you without a demand. It will never be given to me without a demand. And he convinced the other very reluctant participants at the Seneca Falls Convention to support Elizabeth Stanton's call for the vote. We probably would not know or ever hear about Seneca Falls if it wasn't for Frederick Douglass. And he is truly one of the heroes of my book. He believes in universal suffrage, and he also calls himself a woman's rights man for the rest of his life, and he truly is. He will go on to attend almost every women's rights and suffrage meeting till the end of his life. In the years since Seneca Falls, tens of thousands of dedicated suffragists waged over 900 local, state, and national campaigns to win the ballot. They traveled hundreds of thousands of miles. Let's see if there we go. Oh. They traveled hundreds of thousands of miles to do, as Susan Anthony described it, organize, educate, and agitate in tiny towns and big cities all across the country. You see them begin in horse and wagon at the beginning of the movement, and by the end, they're in cars. They had to travel because they had to change hearts and minds. They had to convince men, but they even had to convince women that they needed and should want the vote. So they had to change minds about women's role in society. And it was a stupendous feat of organization, because they went around the country without any of the communications or transportation means that we take for granted today. When the movement began, passenger train travel was in its infancy. There was no transcontinental railroad yet. There was no typewriter. There was no telephone. And even when my book takes place in Nashville in 1920, there's no radio in use yet. And as one young woman in my publisher's office read the manuscript, and she came into my editor and she said, wow, these women were amazing. I don't know how they organized all this without Facebook. But they did. They held meetings like this one. They held rallies like this one. And they marched. which was not considered proper for women to do. Here's, again, a meeting. This actually is a meeting being held in Nashville. Here they are. They didn't wear pink pussy hats, but they did wear their marching uniforms, white dresses with yellow sashes. And you'll see that when suffrage is commemorated, often it's white with yellow. And here's some great pictures of women marching. This one actually in my city of Baltimore in 1912. Sometimes they got a little carried away with their costumes. Today it's hard to imagine how brave you had to be to actually march in public like that, to publicly support women's equality, because the suffragists were not taken very well. Communities often did not accept their advocacy. They endured contempt and ridicule in their communities, in their churches, in their clubs, in the press, and even in their own families. And here's some pictures of the anti-suffragists distributed showing what they thought should be done with suffragists, basically keep them quiet. They were pelted with rotten eggs and spoiled vegetables. They were attacked by mobs of angry men and boys. They were denounced as radicals, perverts, traitors, anarchists, bad wives and mothers, even Bolsheviks. They were derided. We're going to look at some more pictures. Whoops, that went too fast. Here, again, you have a choice. You could be a loving mother, or you could be a crazy zealot on the street advocating for women's suffrage. They were derided as unattractive old maids. And again, here's an anti-suffrage cartoon showing the suffragette meetings. You can hear some plain things, and you can see them too. Again, attacking women for what they look like. It's done today, just as it was done a century ago. They were accused of upsetting the home, that working for suffrage, or even if women got the vote, it was going to upset the American home. It was going to alter gender roles. So here you see, when women vote, mom is smoking a cigar and reading the sporting news, and dad is having to hold the screaming babies and knit his own clothes. So again, this is frightening. This is a sense that dad is going to have to do some housework maybe. And the whole idea of women being equal is very frightening to some people. Again, they weren't subtle about this fear. What will men wear when women wear the pants? Many of the suffrage movement leaders were actually young women and even girls when they first came to the realization that women were not being treated equally and that something needed to be done about it. And I tell this because I want you to recognize that even at a tender age, girls can have a sense of what's right, what's wrong, and set their mind to making change. Elizabeth Cady Stanton was the daughter of a judge, and she would sit in the back of his courtroom and she would listen, and he would often have to say to a woman who would come for legal advice, "I'm sorry, madam, but I can't help you. The law does not protect you." And she was very upset about this. She got very angry, and she decided the way that she could fix the law would be to go through her father's law books and cut out the offending statutes with a scissor. And her father got wind of this plan, and he stopped her, and he said, "No, Elizabeth, that's not the way to change the law. You'll just have to grow up and change it when you grow up." He had no idea that she actually would do that. Susan Anthony was a young teacher, just in her first job, when she realized the male teachers were being paid double what she was being paid. And when she tried to protest this at a teachers' convention, she was told to sit down and be quiet because women were not allowed to speak at the teachers' convention. This got her very angry, and she decided something needed to be done. And Carrie Chapman Catt, who we will find in Nashville in the summer of 1920. She was a protege of Susan Anthony and later becomes the leader of the largest wing of the suffrage organization. She was just 13 when she realized that on election day, her father and her brothers and even the hired hands who couldn't read were able to go to vote. And her mother, who was very well read and very interested in politics, could not. And she said it was like being slapped in the face when she realized her mother couldn't vote. And when she asked about this, she was told by her father, well, voting is too important to be left to women. This really upset her, and she vowed then that when she grew up, she was going to work to change the laws that prevented women from having a voice in their government. And she devoted 30 years of her life to that cause. Other suffragists like Alice Paul and Ida B. Wells, the fearless African-American civil rights and suffrage leader, were only in their 20s when they began working for the movement. Many high school and college students were very active in the suffrage movement. Some joined Alice Paul in picketing the White House and were arrested and imprisoned. And here you see, this was called College Day in the picketing the White House, and these are University of Maryland, Leland Stanford University, and you see several of them represented. And so there are college women there. And high school students also got involved. And including one of them was Tennessee suffrage leader Sue Shelton White. That is not her behind bars, but she was arrested and imprisoned. And she will also be very important in that final battle in Nashville in 1920. And here's Sue White. And here she is with a Tennessee banner protesting the idea that women can't vote. Tennessee women were active in the suffrage movement, though they faced shaming for questioning social conventions and what were called traditional Southern values. Here in Nashville, a robust suffrage organization was formed, and the leader of the Nashville Suffs was a Ward Belmont alumna, Anne Dallas Dudley. Anne could have pursued the comfortable life of a Nashville society woman, but she believed in women's rights, and she took on the role of an activist to help her sisters. She was president of the Nashville Equal Suffrage League and the Tennessee Suffrage Association. She was also a vice president of the National American Women's Suffrage Association. So she's active both on the local and on the national level. Anne served the cause in another way too, as a model and as a symbol. She was very beautiful and very eloquent, and her husband, Guilford Dudley, supported her in all her endeavors. She was a wife, she was a mother, as well as a suffragist. She had it all. And this photo, as a loving mother with her children reading nursery rhymes to her, was distributed by the Nashville suffragists to counteract the idea that the way suffragists were being stereotyped by the aunties as being ugly and not maternal and not womanly. And this was brilliant advertising. They sent these pictures around for years after the children had grown up. They were still sending these pictures around to prove that women could be suffragists and mothers too. And Anne will also play a major role in the ratification drama here in Nashville in 1920. Tennessee women stood up for their rights and faced the opposition to suffrage very bravely. And Dudley also, let's see. Okay, there's another picture of Anne with the children. Anne led the 1912 suffrage march in Nashville, the first suffrage parade in the South. We've looked at that before. And there are other suffrage events in Tennessee we're going to take a look at. Here's a suffrage parade in Chattanooga with a flower-decorated car. And the yellow rose was a symbol of the suffragists, the red rose, the symbol of the anti-suffragists. Here again, this is in Chattanooga. speaking on the stump like a political campaigner. Again, you had to stand up and take advantage, gather a crowd around you. This takes a lot of guts to do, to stand up and do this. And women did this sometimes 8 and 12 times a day. There were other prominent Nashville suffragists, including Catherine Kenny and Juno Frankie Pierce, who we see here, who organized the African American women in Nashville to support and work for suffrage. Another way Nashville women helped the cause was Ward Belmont faculty member Pauline Towson, who taught public speaking here to train suffragists to be better orators. When you had to get up on the trunk of a car and give a speech, you needed to have speaking skills. Many powerful Tennessee men were also friends of the suffrage movement, and they helped with ratification in the legislature. Quite a few of those men have connections to Ward Seminary, and so to Harpeth Hall. And I write about several of these sympathetic Nashville men in my book, including Luke Lee, who's the publisher of the Nashville Tennessean, Governor Tom Rye, who promoted women's suffrage throughout the state, Thomas Riddick and Joseph Ackland, who were attorneys who also helped in legal and legislative matters. So it took more than just women, it took their male sympathetic friends to get this done. So Tennessee suffragists were ready when the decisive battle over ratification came to Nashville. And the battle raged in the State House, in the Hermitage Hotel where everyone was staying. It was called the War of the Roses. Here's some coverage in the Tennessean. Now, not all, here's again showing some of the younger women who were involved in the fight. Not all Tennessee women supported ratification. The anti-suffragists had strong support too. And here's a picture of the opening of the anti-suffrage headquarters on the mezzanine level of the Hermitage Hotel. So everyone gathered in Nashville in August of 1920, and it got really wild. There's bribes and booze and propaganda and blackmail, conspiracies and kidnappings and fistfights. The newspapers call it suffrage Armageddon. And the outcome remains in doubt until the very last moment. And I'm not going to spoil it for you, but it does come down to a single vote of conscience by the youngest member of the Tennessee legislature, 24-year-old Harry T. Byrne of Nyota in East Tennessee. And Harry receives a letter from his mother the morning of the vote, and it makes him think about what is the right thing to do, even if it threatens his own political career. And here's the letter. His decision makes history, and it propels the 19th Amendment into the Constitution. It gives the right to vote to not just Tennessee women, but to all American women. However, black women in Tennessee and in all the other southern states would not be able to enjoy their right to vote for another 4 decades. Jim Crow laws, poll taxes, literacy tests, intimidation, and violence would keep them from voting until the passage of the Voting Rights Act in 1965. There are important lessons to be learned from this fight, this long fight for women's suffrage. Social change is slow, political change is hard, and the struggle to expand our democracy is ongoing. It wasn't just won in 1920. It's not over now. You have a part to play in this. Changing attitudes and changing laws takes persistence. Now, you may be involved in a cause or an issue right now: climate change, racial justice, immigration rights, gender equality. So I hope the story I tell in the Woman's Hour, the story that's so much a Nashville story, will teach you, the new generation of activists, that protest is patriotic and it's very necessary, but it must be followed up by well-designed and sustained political strategy. The suffragists didn't just march and demonstrate and picket. They also wrote legislation and debated and lobbied. And they carried on after the 19th Amendment was secure. Carrie Catt founded the League of Women Voters, and Alice Paul had legislation entered into Congress. It was called the Equal Rights Amendment. That was 96 years ago in 1923, and it is still not ratified. The vote is a prayer, as Carrie Catt described it. The vote is power. And very soon you will possess that power. It's a great gift which the suffragists and all your foremothers worked and fought and dreamed about to give it to you. So your job is to treasure it, to protect it for all citizens, and to use it. Thank you very much. And here is the suffrage centennial monument in Centennial Park. You should go see it. It has many of the women I spoke about today, and it's really very moving, and you can go visit it. Anyway, questions? We're going to ask some questions, I hope. Okay, yes, please stand up. Thank you. Hello.
I'm Maggie Sullivan, and I'm a senior. My question is, how does your book address the exclusion of Black activists from the movement, especially people like Ida B. Wells, by white women who wanted to control the racial narrative of the movement?
Oh, yes. I deal with the racial aspects of the movement and the history of it quite thoroughly. And yes, Ida B. Wells, there's that famous picture of her. In 1913, there was a big march in Washington, the first national suffrage parade. And Ida B. Wells, who had left Tennessee, and because her office was firebombed, she was a great anti-lynching activist as well as being a suffragist. She lived in Chicago. She founded the Alpha Club, which is the first African-American suffrage organization. And she went to Washington to march. And there was, the organizers of the march were afraid because Washington, D.C. was a southern city, a segregated city. They worried that the white women might not want to have Ida Wells marching with them. So they asked all the black women sororities to march in the back. And Ida B. Wells said, no, I'm not going to do that. And there's this wonderful picture of her just breaking into line to march with the Illinois suffragists. And her white suffrage sisters embrace her. And she marches with them. So that's we hear one of that part of that story. We sometimes don't hear the other part. But there's no denying that black women were not put into the forefront of the movement. In some cases, it was because they feared that the racist men in the legislature and in the Congress would not listen to a movement that had black women in the forefront. These are the kind of judgment calls and moral compromises that were made that we need to study and to learn from and not repeat those mistakes, but also to understand what was going on and why they would have even thought that way. So I deal with the racial aspects a lot. I think it's really important, and it's a part of the story that is often not taught, and it's high time that we deal with that and put it into context, understand what went wrong, understand how important it is to have a movement that's inclusive. But there's some very interesting aspects of it. Of course, the racial issue gets weaponized by the anti-suffragists. You'll see in Tennessee, what happens in Nashville, it's the anti-suffragists who use race as a weapon to try to convince people not the legislature not to ratify. And basically, the 19th Amendment is rejected by most of the southern states, including Maryland, where I live, because it would allow black women to vote. And the 19th Amendment does allow all women to vote. Absolutely, totally colorblind. The problem is it gets subverted by the Jim Crow laws, who don't allow it, who undermine the law. So that's how it happens. So yes, it's an important part of my book.
So we're out of time. But if anybody else has questions, they can ask that.
Okay.
But otherwise, can we give her a hand?